So welcome to another weekly Fortuna Masterclass. As you know, every Wednesday, we take you through either specific schools and a deep dive into their cultures, their programs, their personalities. But this month of July, we focused on all of the different components of the application. And today it's the turn of letters of recommendation. What do you mean you recommend us go 5-week vacation in Sicily? Get them back so that you can talk to them, get their support. Well, that's some of what we're going to be discussing in the next hour. And of course, with any of these Fortuna masterclasses, drawing on the expertise of my colleagues. I've often described the Fortuna team as a dream team. I have over 40 colleagues with insider admissions experience from pretty much every top US and European business school that you can imagine. And with all of that team, we've just been ranked again as one of the outstanding admissions coaching firms with hundreds and hundreds of very happy, successful clients, not just getting into the dream schools, getting great scholarships, and of course, starting such exciting new chapters. One of the first steps for that is reaching out and sharing your backgrounds, your story, your accomplishments, your academic and professional experience, things that you've been doing in the community. We offer free consultations to anybody that reaches out to us and take those consultations very, very seriously. We do look through that resume and have lots of questions ready for you to really find out where business school might fit in the next steps of your personal and professional growth. For today's session, I'm delighted to be joined by two of my expert colleagues, Rachel Erickson Hee. Rachel, I always like to think of as a Stanford MBA student whispering to one of her classmates, Derek, "Hey, Derek, what matters most to you and why?" And I think that question that Rachel may or may not have asked Derek stuck in his mind because, of course, when Derek became the director of admissions at Stanford GSB, he introduced that question, and it's been going strong for the last 19 years. Rachel is both an alum of the school and also a former GSB interviewer. I'm also joined by Jessica Chung. Jessica has over a decade of insider admissions experience, initially at USC, and then she was a senior director, associate director of admissions at UCLA Anderson. In fact, Jessica wrote a piece about letters of recommendation that we'll be talking about today that has been read by thousands and thousands of poets and quants readers, and we'll be drawing on some of that expertise and advice. Now, I mentioned that these masterclasses every Wednesday at noon East Coast time. It's just gone breakfast on the West Coast. Perhaps it's approaching midnight in Singapore. Last week, we took a deep dive into the essays of the top schools and what they're really looking for. As you know, today's session is going to be about letters of recommendation. And then next week, we move into your resume. Not that resume that you might have used to get a job in the tech industry, but a resume that really then connects with the MBA admissions office. And then alongside that, those application forms, where there are all of those mini essays, key questions where the schools really want to find out more about you. But today, we're talking about other voices that are involved in this whole process. So I'm going to jump right in. And Rachel, perhaps my first question to you, in terms of what schools want to know from recommenders. This is not something that they take lightly. They invest a lot of time to read these letters of recommendation. So what is it that they're looking to find out about a candidate?
Sure. So when you, sorry, can you hear me?
Clear.
Okay, great. So when you ask what is it that schools fundamentally want to know from recommenders, it's really about understanding their and your leadership potential. And when business schools talk about leadership, they're not talking about how many people you manage. They're looking for people who have made a difference in an organization. Let me just check in because I'm hearing a little bit of feedback on my end. I want to make sure that the sound is okay for everybody else. Okay, good. And so what does this mean, making a difference in an organization? So to understand the qualities and attributes that they think goes into that, the best thing to do is actually look at the recommendation form where schools are asking you to be ranked on a number of qualities. Harvard, Stanford, the Common Application, there's a lot of schools that have this ranking. And this tells you what it is business schools want to know in this recommendation. When you look at the attributes they list, however, there's at least a dozen of them. And your recommender is not going to be able to talk about all of these. So it is important to recognize that some of them are necessary, but not sufficient on their own to get you into business school. For example, qualities such as integrity and maturity, these are attributes business schools expect you to have. You are not going to get into business school without them, but others are more typically key points of differentiation and where your recommender should focus. And let me just pause here for a second and see if there's anything that can be done about the feedback. Let me see if this makes it better. Okay. Sorry about the technical difficulties there. So basically, when you are looking at those qualities like integrity and maturity, you need them. Business schools are not going to let you in without them, but for most people, those are not necessarily going to be a key point of differentiation. There are a couple of other topics where you are more likely to genuinely be able to distinguish yourself from other people and show what is unique about you. And those key points probably involve the following areas. The first is interpersonal skills and influence. So this is how effective are you when working with other people? How influential are you in getting other people to listen to you and to act on your suggestions? The next one is teamwork and developing others. So how do you work with others to accomplish a mutual goal? Are you someone who helps others grow and develop their own talents and who brings out the best in people around you, even your superiors? The next one is creative, analytical, and strategic thinking. So really fundamentally, what ideas have you come up with or contributed to projects that have made a difference in your organization? And then next, resilience, curiosity, and initiative. Business schools are looking for someone who goes above and beyond expectations, who looks beyond the obvious, and who can overcome obstacles and difficult challenges to get things done. And then finally, communication. Are you someone who can clearly and effectively communicate with your audience, whoever that is? And don't forget that this is something they're also going to be looking for evidence of throughout your application, not just explicitly what your recommender says about that. So do keep that in mind. So most of the recommenders are probably going to cover these topics, since this is where an outstanding candidate is often going to shine. However, I do want to make it clear, if you are someone who has displayed exceptional abilities in another area, then it could make sense for your recommender to focus on that. So maybe you have an example where you did encounter a particularly difficult ethical dilemma, something that is not seen every day, that did require unusual integrity and maturity. And then in that case, maybe your recommender does talk about that because that is what distinguishes you. So now that you know what it is the business schools are looking for, I want to try and talk about a couple of tips to make it clear how your recommenders can effectively communicate this in their recommendation. So first of all, your recommender should focus on what you do that stands out and makes you exceptional, not on how well you do your job. Business schools expect people to be good at their jobs. That's a given, and they're looking for something that goes beyond that. Some examples of things that would go beyond that are you're someone who is able to solve a particularly difficult problem. You inspired or helped a struggling colleague. You came up with an idea that no one else had thought of, and then you actually convinced people to try it. You work persistently to establish a client relationship or a partnership when everyone else had given up on this particular project. You successfully are able to deal with very challenging personalities, or maybe you've identified a new strategy for a group or a division or a company. These are all things that are going beyond just doing your job well and showing that you have something more. The next important thing is that your recommender needs to use concrete examples to illustrate these points. It is not just enough to say that you solve difficult problems or you come up with new ideas. They want your recommender to point to specific evidence in your past experience that shows you doing this. And one thing to make clear here is that sometimes this can involve telling a story about a particular incident and going into a lot of detail on it. That can be one approach that is very effective. But sometimes it's more general and it's about a pattern of behavior. And then you might want to have your recommender use a briefer example to illustrate it. So for example, they may say this person is a trusted voice in all our discussions, even though they are the most junior person on the team. For example, they're the one who came up with the idea too, and then you would give the idea. That's a shorter example. It's not a full story, but it can still be very effective because you are pointing to specifically what it is that you did, or your recommender is pointing to what it is that you did that made a difference in a way that the admissions committee is going to be able to see and understand and know that it is up to what their expectations are. The recommendation should also be something that helps you come to life. It should capture what is unique about you, because business schools don't just want to know this person is amazing, they're special, they're wonderful. They want to know how you are special. What are the particular qualities and attributes that you have that are going to help you make a stellar contribution and be a vital member of your community, wherever that is. They also want to know what type of a leader you will be. How do you get things done? How do you work with people? Everybody has a different style. Everybody has different strengths and weaknesses. Everybody has a different approach, and they want to know that. And then they also want to see who you are as a person. What would it be like to have you as a team member or as a classmate? What they're really looking for here is they want to see the person you are on the page. And the more that the recommender can show you as a whole, vivid, real person, the better that recommendation is going to be, and the more effective it is going to be as an advocacy for your admission to business school. And then there are a couple of additional points just to think about. The first is your recommender can provide context that you may not be able to. So if there are some really messy details about why a project was so challenging, that it had been stalled for 5 years and no one wanted to touch it, or why a client or coworker is extremely difficult to work with, and why your performance there really stands out, this is the perfect person to explain that. This is not stuff you necessarily can put on your resume, but your recommender can give that color and show all of that nuance that really makes situations come to life and explains why what you did was so impressive. And then finally, your recommender should be clear and explain your impact on the organization. If your recommender is writing about the times when you made a real difference to the organization, to their operations, their bottom line, their revenues, to new products, to their strategy, to the culture, or to the performance of the organization, all of those things are going to make for a really strong recommendation. And now I'm going to turn it back to Matt and Jennifer for our next section.
You've got us up to a fantastic start, Rachel. I think even with the sort of depth of insight, really tangible illustrations, impact. I suppose, turning to Jessica, sometimes, you've worked with so many successful applicants, Jessica, applying to the top schools, and they start by saying, well, surely everyone just has recommenders that like them, that they're all enthusiastic about them. So, does it really make a difference? But I guess, we frame it in terms of the role that those recommendations can play. And Rachel, touches on how compelling they can be. So take us behind the curtain into AdCom. And as you're, working all together in that team and trying to get to better know candidates, what role these letters of recommendations play as you're assessing a candidate?
Yeah, absolutely. And Rachel did an amazing job of just kind of walking through every piece of what the purpose of the recommendation is and just how AdComs are evaluating the letters, what they're looking for. So there's probably going to be a lot of overlap kind of between what I'm sharing and what Rachel already discussed. But I think it's important to kind of reiterate a lot of these points because it is, oftentimes, and I think we mentioned this earlier, Matt, or you mentioned it just before our session today, that applicants tend to kind of overlook or undervalue kind of the impact and the power a recommendation can bring to the overall narrative and the shaping of the story that a candidate will tell about their candidacy, about their readiness for business school, their fit, so many different aspects of who they are and really resonating and building this emotional rapport with the admissions team. So it really does, the recommendations play a really critical role in the evaluation process. And just kind of to take a step back, I would say, again, you probably heard this so many times, but the application review is a very holistic process. So there's not just, one piece of, of the application itself that takes precedence over everything else. It's really about building this whole comprehensive story. And that's the reason why admissions teams read every application from cover to cover, because you're getting and gleaning so many insights and so many additional meaty details about a candidate. That's going to be so important to really building a genuine understanding of who that person is and looking for reasons to admit a candidate. How are you going to be a great fit? Obviously you want to be a strong candidate as far as doing well academically, having great options for employment, career progression beyond, but that's really not just what business school is about. There's so much about, being able to connect with others, helping others, your classmates, being a really meaningful, important, critical piece of the fabric of the community, both as a student and as an alum in the future. So all of these factors are really important when adcoms are evaluating a candidate. And just again, and specifically with the recommendations, I always find it very fascinating because it's the only real piece of the application. You don't have a hand in crafting yourself. Like, you're not writing the recommendation, or you should not be. You should, you're writing your essays, you're crafting your resume, you're making the, building the relationships with members of the community and, all these other factors. But the recommendation is really the only piece of the application where we have an outside perspective from someone or from folks who know you, your impact, your personality, your character, your values very well. So it's really critical to find recommenders who are going to be champions, who are going to advocate, who are going to be your cheerleaders for you, for your aspirations, and really to convey that in a very authentic and sincere way. So on one hand, obviously, you want recommenders who are going to, talk in great detail about your actions, your impact, your potential, all these things. But at the same time, if they're kind of not really that enthusiastic about, and it just comes across as a bit academic or dry, it's hard to get a vivid portrait of who you are as a candidate. So on one hand, like I mentioned, recommendations, they're going to support the information about your career history, your progression, and provide some of those more meaty insights like what Rachel mentioned, with depth, with specific examples. So oftentimes you'll see recommendations or recommenders who are very supportive and enthusiastic and just have a lot of praise for a candidate, but there's not a lot of substance behind that. And that's something that we'll address maybe later in Pitfalls. But that's where a powerful recommendation will bring. I kind of liken it to, for example, when I was in high school, I loved to read the Cliff Notes versions of, assigned readings. So you kind of get the framework, right, of what a book is about. I kind of look at that to a resume. The resume is going to give lots of insight about your career progression, your impact, your, the outcomes that you provided, right, in any given role or in a job. But it's hard to really get additional insight on the specifics, the context, why, what happened. We want the details. And that's what a recommendation can provide. So oftentimes, when I read a really compelling recommendation, I remember at Anderson, there would be obviously examples that maybe, that were touched upon, or projects that were discussed in general on a resume. But there's so much more color and depth and so much more information, kind of like what you mentioned, Matt, about what happened behind the scenes, the challenges that you face, the context, the struggles, so there's just a lot more story and a lot more understanding of what you went through. What were the challenges, the obstacles you faced, and why you were successful? And it makes for a much more multidimensional understanding of a candidate versus just knowing you were successful, or you had this challenge and you were successful and it resulted in like this percentage increase in sales, or this percentage decrease in, hours like performed on a task or whatnot, right? Which is really helpful to know as well. But really, again, like the story and the additional layer of insight behind, some of those outcomes that a recommendation can provide is going to be so helpful. And your resume is really not a place where we can elaborate on that. And for the most part, most schools don't really have a space for you to talk in, specifically about the past, about, in depth about some of the challenges you face in your profession or professionally. Most essays tend to be more forward facing. Maybe there's some reflection definitely that you do in telling your story, but there's a lot of also forward facing information and insight that the essays want to get out of. So the recommendations, again, are just going to add that additional, just kind of build you out as a three-dimensional human being. You're not just what we used to call our flat friends at Anderson. Like, we would just read this application and just kind of get to know you in a very limited capacity from the information that you provide for us. So that recommendation is going to help to highlight your strengths and get another person's perspective on the mark you left on a project or a team, an organization, whatnot. Like Rachel mentioned, bringing those qualities that business schools really desire: leadership, interpersonal skills, resilience, teamwork, etc. They want to also know, are you going to be successful, not just in the future, and what impact have you made, but are you also going to be able to connect with your classmates? Are you going to be someone who's going to support one another to succeed? Are you going to be able to, sometimes take on leadership roles, but other times maybe you need to take a step back and be a supporter, right? It just situation and every dynamic, between, especially when you're working with what others, is going to be very fluid and dynamic and different. And are you going to have like that EQ, and have you shown that in the past, to be able to kind of balance these different roles, obviously with the desire to like continue to progress and thrive in your career and in your professional life. And something that I really valued in the recommendations is also this element of bringing humanity into who you are as a candidate. Like, obviously, if you're perfect, you won't need to go to business school. Like, you're going to already have like the best leadership skills and interpersonal skills or whatever, right? You need to thrive and move on in your career. But, there's a reason why you want to go and get your MBA. You've done your reflection, that there are areas that you want to improve upon, and you are aware of those areas. And what a strong recommendation will provide is really being able to speak to your imperfections and how you were able to take maybe feedback, because most schools will ask this question about, what is a piece of constructive feedback you've received and how did you deal with it, whatnot. To answer that question very authentically and sincerely is sometimes really challenging. Like, you feel like you don't want to show the cracks, right, to an AdCom. You want to be able to show that you're this really amazing person, but that's not really going to help to, again, create that emotional connection. So I would say they're really critical to understanding a candidate's aspects like coachability. Oftentimes you're going to be dealing with tough feedback, really tough information that you're going to have to kind of digest. How did you do that in the past? What did you do to improve? What was your reaction to it? And so that, again, just adds that additional layer of dimension to who you are. And to be able to understand from another person's perspective about how you were able to deal with that information and what you did to move forward and how you became a better person as a result. It's hard to discuss that in other parts of your application, but that coachability factor and the ability to reflect and to take kind of tough feedback, tough criticism, and use it to make you a stronger leader, to make you a stronger person, to just continue to add value as an individual is so important. And I think the recommendations where I felt like did the best job in that were ones that were just kind of putting something in that they felt like the outcomes would want and would be okay with. That's something very digestible, like, oh, this person is a perfectionist, or something that's kind of fluffy and a little cliche. It's okay to be real, but obviously you want to frame that in something where there's improvements and it's something that you took very seriously and you want to move forward to become a better person. And the last part of this, I think, is AdComs want to know some likability. They want you to be able to, again, get along with your classmates, get along with people from various walks of life, lots of different experiences, goals, not always going to be on the same page as far as what you're, as far as agreeing on how to solve a problem, how to approach a problem, how to, whatnot. And that's real life, So how are you going to do that in a way where you're not going to always be butting heads all the time and kind of, being stuck, but rather you're going to use your differences and your different perspectives to be able to move forward and be constructive. So again, a lot of different things that AdComs are looking for in the letters of recommendation. And again, just going to reiterate that they can just add such an important perspective and insight into really giving more color and shape to your candidacy. And I'll turn it back over to you, Matt.
Well, perhaps before we then look at who to approach as possible recommenders, just a follow-on, Jessica, you talked about this holistic process. There are lots of pieces of the puzzle. In terms of the chronology, typically, is AdComs getting to know you first through the resume and then looking at recommendations? I think about the HBS application where they say, we've read the resume, we've read the letters of recommendation, and now for the essay, what more should we know about you? Which implies a sort of a flow of information that they're looking to gather. Would you typically look to get that added depth and color that goes beyond the bullet points once you had gone through the resume?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, personally, I like in the Cliff Notes version, as a resume, or I also think about it almost like a sketch. Like if I'm an artist, I sketch out like my, kind of the idea of what I want to present as my final masterpiece. But, and the resume, I think, provides that framework, right? And the structure. The recommendations and of course, like other parts of the application are going to add like the dimension, the color, the perspectives, right? The shadows, like all of those things are going to bring it to life. So it's great to have, and like I can't definitely I'm not undervaluing the what a resume brings. It's so important, of course, to your overall application. But don't rely on it. I think is what I guess my point is, don't rely on that as the only means as to what the adcoms are going to be looking at when they're really painting a good understanding of you, your impact, your career kind of, or your professional progression, and your potential for future success, and really just getting to know who you are as well.
With the team at Fortuna, we have worked with clients that had recommenders. Some were heads of state from the G20. Others were CEOs of the Fortune 500, global managing partners at McKinsey. We've even had members of royal families that have been put forward as possible recommenders. So Rachel, I suppose this question, what makes a good recommender, which sort of folds into that, who you might then be thinking to approach?
Yes. So the most important thing is that your recommender should be someone who knows you and who knows your work well. Because as we explained, they really have to bring you to life on the paper. They have to provide these real, clear, specific examples to illustrate who you are and why they think highly of you. And if they're not someone who knows you well, it doesn't matter who they are, it's going to fall flat and they're not going to be able to do a good job. So the more personal, the more detailed, and the more authentic the recommendation is, the stronger it will be. So go with someone who really knows you well. Along the lines of what Matt said, it doesn't matter if they're a head of state. Please don't make this mistake of choosing someone because you think that they're going to be impressive to the admissions committee if they don't know you as well as someone else. It doesn't matter if they're an alumni of a particular school or what their job title is. It really is about them being able to describe you thoroughly and honestly. One other thing to keep in mind with that is it is sometimes helpful if your recommender can explain the context of your peer group. So if they are someone who works with very talented people, whatever the field, and can communicate that they understand what exceptional performance is, this is going to lend authority to their advocacy. And if there's someone who isn't, perhaps someone who works with that peer group, but has another peer group that they can identify with and explain why you would fit in the exceptional category, that is also helpful to give that context of how they are evaluating you and where they are coming from. Also, for people who have recommenders who may not be great writers or who may not have English as their native language, don't worry, this is fine. They don't need to be a good writer. The schools don't actually care about spelling mistakes and typos from your recommender. They're not going to hold that against you. This is different from your application where you're expected to review it very thoroughly. They know that the recommender is a really busy person and that they are worried more about the context of what you say than how you say it. Not everyone is a natural communicator. What they say is the most important thing. And then there's sort of a couple of specific questions that often come up about who should I get to write my recommendation? The first recommendation and question is about someone who has supervision of your work. Most business schools ideally want someone who is a direct supervisor or who has recently been a direct supervisor of yours if you're in a more project-based setting. And this is the ideal, of course. However, they do know that this is not always possible. Sometimes it's a new job. Sometimes you have a new boss. Sometimes the company isn't even aware that you're applying to business school. And in those cases, it is fine that your recommendation isn't from your direct supervisor, but just please make sure to explain in the additional information section of your application why you were unable to get that recommendation from someone who is a recent or current direct supervisor. They're going to want to know that. And then another thing that often comes up that I want to mention is it is fine if they're no longer at the company. Ideally, one of your recommenders will be currently at your company, but it isn't uncommon for at least one of them, and even occasionally both recommendations, to be from someone who is no longer at your firm. Once again, that is fine. If there is context you need to explain, that is what the additional information section is for. And then another big question that comes up is, do you want 2 recommenders from your current job or company, or 1 from your current one and 1 from your past one? And here, what I'd also like to say is it really depends on your circumstances. Everybody's is different and every situation is unique. You want to choose the people who you think are going to be the best advocates for you. So maybe you're someone whose current job is really demanding and you've done fantastic work and you think this is where you've really shown. Then you probably want both of your recommendations to come from your current job. Maybe you're someone who's done a great job at 2 really demanding positions and you want to make that clear, in which case you're going to choose 1 and 1. So just take that into account. And remember that there's not a right answer here. It's what is right for you and your recommenders and your situation. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that if you're choosing 2 people from the same company, make sure that they highlight different projects or different aspects of your skills and qualities so that the recommendations don't end up being redundant. And then finally, people sometimes have one recommendation that comes from work and they want to use somebody else who is providing a recommendation from outside of work. And my advice here is that this is fine as long as this other recommender is knowledgeable about your qualities in the aspects that you are being ranked on. So take a really good look at the ranking form and the qualities and skills that they are going to be asked to evaluate you on. And if your recommender is someone who you think is going to really know where you stand on all or most of them, then they're probably also going to be an effective advocate. But if there's someone whose perspective is more limited and they don't have any insight into your interpersonal skills, they just know your strategic thinking, for example, then they may not be the right recommender. And it might be that you want to talk about and highlight the great things you've done outside of work in another space in your application. So those are my sort of tactical suggestions for how to find the person who's going to be the best advocate for you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Matt to talk a bit about some of the logistics.
Yeah, and I guess just staying with that, Rachel, you talked about if you're approaching 2 individuals from the same organization, and we'll be looking at how to best work with recommenders, but to make sure that that second individual brings something fresh, brings new perspectives, otherwise perhaps a lost opportunity. One of our viewers is in a situation having spent 3 years in the early stage of their career in a company, then switching another 3 years in the second position. Now, one of the recommenders from that first role that he or she had wants them to write the recommendation themselves. We often hear this and just send it to them and they'll sign it. Just your thoughts beyond the ethics involved of being put in that situation.
So, the first thing to do is ask your recommender. They often think they're doing you a favor. They think, oh, this is great. You're going to be able to write a fantastic recommendation. I won't have to do any work, win-win. But it's so hard to write a really effective recommendation that gives this different perspective and new set of eyes yourself. It's actually incredibly tough to do well, particularly when you have the embarrassing factor that then somebody else is going to read this recommendation who you may work for. And if you've said things that are too amazing, it's going to sound awkward. And so that often leads to people underselling themselves when they do this. And it's a really, really difficult situation. Whenever possible, if you can explain to your recommender that it doesn't matter how well it's written, it doesn't matter what or how good a writer they are, but it is extraordinarily helpful for them to actually write it themselves. That is what we recommend. And sometimes if you're choosing between 2 recommenders and you have 2 good options, one of whom will write the recommendation, then 100% just say, that's great. Thank you so much for offering to let me do that, but I'm going to go with this other person, and choose the person who actually is going to write the recommendation for you themselves.
Jessica, presumably, could you tell when someone had written their own letter of recommendation?
Yeah, it's funny. I was just thinking about that right now. Keep in mind that adcoms read thousands of applications a year, thousands, go through thousands of recommendations. And at that point, it's almost becomes, you develop this sixth sense where if there's something about the tone, the writing style, or something that's similar, you can't pinpoint it, like you can't directly, find evidence for it, but like you just know there's a visceral reaction to this because you've done this for so long, you've just developed this weird innate sense. So your spidey senses go up. So yes, I think you can do it. I mean, it's happened. Like I don't doubt that, but just know that it's a big risk. And just like Rachel mentioned, it's hard to write a recommendation for yourself, and it's very awkward. And you do end up underselling, or it just feels like you're like you're being overconfident. Like there's elements of it that just makes it very uncomfortable at times. And again, like that tone and just the writing style, like there's things that the adcoms can pick up on. So it's a very risky strategy to go with.
Well, of course, finding the right person and the benefits that then come with it. Rachel, just a couple of other viewers and some great questions that people are sending in. I'm going to try to weave these two questions together. One is from Eunice, who, like many applicants, is applying to multiple schools and therefore wondering if they should approach multiple recommenders to lessen their burden. Perhaps you can talk about the way that recommendations are structured and schools understanding busy individuals. But perhaps there's also then another element that Sanjana has raised, finding recommenders who perhaps can then speak to a school's particular values or mission. And this idea of, would I be better with an alum of the school that can talk about the GSB, about Anderson Booth, any of the schools, given their past experience? What would you say for those two questions?
So what I would say is you never need to have two different people write a recommendation. If it's because you think that schools are looking for different things, or a particular person has a certain connection to a school, I think that's a belief that people often have, but it isn't necessarily true, and it does sometimes backfire. In general, I would say the business schools are looking for very similar characteristics, and especially with recommendations where so many schools have the same or similar questions, they don't want something different. It's not like Harvard is looking for completely different things than Kellogg. Having said that, there is a little bit of a challenge about the fact that some schools ask different questions or have different word counts, and that can put a little bit of an additional burden on your recommender. The best is to find somebody who you think is a fantastic recommender who is going to be willing to do that little bit of extra work. And it's not usually nearly as much extra work as they think it is. It takes a little bit of extra time, but once they've written the first recommendation, writing the others is really just kind of changing the framing and maybe answering the question slightly differently, cutting some things out, phrasing it slightly differently, but the examples and the stories and the things that they are going to emphasize, those qualities are going to stay consistent. So it's not as much work as you think it is. If you genuinely get a situation where the person can only write one and you have somebody else and they're not as strong a recommender as your original one, then I could see maybe you ask the person who knows going to write a great recommendation to do the one that is going to be submitted to most schools, and you have to ask somebody else to do other schools. But I would suggest trying to get your original recommender and the person you think is going to write the best one, do all of them.
And the idea of having an alum write, Huss talks about pillars of challenging the status quo, that we talk about that sort of collaborative culture at Kellogg, habits of leadership at HBS. Do you think that the voice of an alum that says, well, I did the program and I really think that this candidate will thrive and flourish in the MBA classroom of the school that I know so well?
So, I'd love to hear Jessica's perspective on this. And, from her time, I think it backfires. I think sometimes it works and sometimes it backfires. I've seen both situations. Sometimes that person is a really effective advocate, and their word is taken seriously. But then sometimes, the other person actually wrote you a great recommendation, and you would have been better off submitting that recommendation than getting someone one from someone who's an alum of the school. Jessica, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is tough.
Yeah. Can it backfire?
Yeah. Generally speaking, I think overall, I agree with Rachel. If the sole reason why you're gunning for a particular recommender is because that person is an alum of the school, or is connected to a school in a certain way, and they can only speak of like you within the context of their experience, and you being a good fit with the culture, I think you're gonna miss out on all the other qualities that the adcoms are trying to glean from a recommendation if they can't speak to all those other aspects. Like Rachel mentioned, if you look at that grid or the questions that are asked on the recommendation form, and they can't really speak in depth, with a lot of substance to those other areas, then they're not really getting the information that they want. And there are other ways that alums can advocate for you aside from a recommendation. Like, a lot of schools will accept letters of support informally, to an admissions director, or there's like a specific form. I think like Fuqua has like a form that you fill out online, for alums who want to advocate for client, so there are other pathways to do that where you don't have to sacrifice one of the really critical pieces of the application, to get that alum's perspective in.
And Jessica, one final question from Ankit. In the case of a reapplicant, do you think that they need to change recommenders? Let's imagine that they're it's from 1 year to the next. It's not a 3 or 4 year gap. And instinctively, as we think about direct supervision, it would be the person that supported them last year. So might they want to look elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a good question also. So when I think of reapplicants, think about how your application or you as a candidate have grown and have become a stronger candidate from the original or from the previous year to this year. And if you're thinking strategically about the information, typically schools are only going to ask, or a lot of schools might only ask for one letter of recommendation for you as a reapplicant. And if the content of that recommendation is almost pretty much the same as what the content was in the previous year, there's no, some schools might look at them kind of, original with your reapplication together. Like, I'm not sure, every school is a bit different, but if there seems to have been no growth or not real meaningful change from the recommender's perspective, then that's not going to really help your candidacy to show that you have become stronger from the previous or a more competitive candidate from the previous year. So unless a person can have a lot more substantive, meaningful accomplishments or additional insight they can provide I would consider there, other folks out there that you can reach out to. What about Rachel? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think it's fine if it's the same person, as long as if it's your current boss and they've been your current boss last year and this year, for example, then yes, they should write your recommendation both years because that's something they look for. But to Jessica's point, make sure to update it with new information. And then maybe it's your second recommendation that you also do bring someone new in. And then at the same time, if there's a case where that someone in your past wrote you a good recommendation, you feel very confident in it, and you think it really was the right recommendation, that is one case where maybe they would submit the same recommendation. But clearly, if it's someone from a company you are currently working at and an organization you're currently working at, either get a new recommender or get the same recommender to substantially rewrite the recommendation.
I mean, we have some great slides to guide us, but the questions that are coming in are such quality and relevance, of course, to all of our viewers. I suppose this is also one of the reasons of having those free consultations with Fortuna, to really be able to dig deeper, think about different choices that you might have, the perspectives that they can bring, and back to the points of impact and insight that a recommender will bring. Jessica, round one deadlines. HBS always starts the dance there just at the beginning of the second week of September, and then we go through a very busy month. So in terms of timing and outreach, this is not Labor Day and recommendations due 48 hours later. I'm sure they would suffer if they could turn them out that quickly. So what is the time frame that you think really enables you and the recommender to produce a compelling result?
Yeah. Never underestimate how quickly time will go, especially when you're working with a deadline. So it's really, honestly, it's never too early to start thinking about who to approach for recommendations, and start strategizing early. Don't put it off. It's really highly likely you've worked in different capacities with so many different individuals who can all be potentially really great recommenders, and you need some time to think about how to narrow down those individuals so you're getting really the two or the number that's going to be the best for you. And that takes some time to do that reflection and rumination. So I'd like to start with sometimes maybe just doing a simple list. You kind of go through everyone that you've worked with, where you've had like a really strong key relationship, that you've had some really great working relationships with people who are going to be your advocates. Think about why. It could just, if you kind of start to think about the whys, you'll really start to understand, well, this person might only know me in the context of like this one project and can only speak to my analytical abilities, or only like, in a, very high level where they kind of saw the results of a project, but don't really know all the work and the effort and all the challenges I faced in order to get this done. So like, as you start thinking about it, you'll start to kind of get a better picture of who might be the best recommenders. And it might be people who are different from who you initially like kind of thought that would be the ones that would be writing your recommendations. I mean, obviously, aside from the current supervisor, who is going to most likely be for the vast majority going to be be one out of the two recommenders, but it helps just to kind of give you that framework. Consider the relationship, like how long you've known the individual, how closely you've worked together, the projects that you've worked on, circumstances in which the person has seen you shine or has, overcome like, really challenging obstacles. Something else to consider is how busy is the person. This is sometimes something that's not really in anyone's, kind of top of mind, but you might have a great person in mind, but that person is just swamped and super busy or tends to kind of procrastinate on things. Not to say you should put that person off of your list, but again, that's going to mean a little bit more follow-up, more lead time, just a little bit more work and hand-holding on your side. So, and then another key factor, and we mentioned this multiple times, Rachel and I, is will this person be your advocate? Are they going to be your cheerleader? Not only will this person write, provide compelling examples and insights, in the recommendation, but are they truly supportive of your career, like your personal professional growth over time? Does that person know an MBA is part of this plan? Sometimes, and then there is this delicate, it can be a delicate conversation because you might be working with, in an organization or with individuals who don't know that you are planning to go to business school. And it could be kind of an awkward conversation, or you might be worried it could impact, like your immediate career, like whether it be projects you're put on or promotions that you might get or whatever it might be. So, at the same time, like you want someone who's going to know or have at least an idea. I think that this is part of your long-term goals. And that this is, so when you have the conversation, that person is not going to be blindsided. And if that person doesn't know, then that means probably you're going to want to give them a little bit more time to digest the information, not like give them like a 2-week, hey, I'm planning to go to business school and can you write me this letter? So that's also something to keep in mind. And like Rachel mentioned before, most schools would like to see at least one current supervisor, but don't forget and be open to casting the net a little bit wider. If you've been deeply involved in outside activities that really showcase those qualities, again, kind of referring back to the kind of the questions in the recommendation. If there's somebody else outside of your immediate organization, or maybe within your organization, but you're working in like a different capacity, like on a volunteer work level, like on a committee, or something else that's not maybe part of your day-to-day, there could be someone who can advocate for you and really speak to a lot of those qualities that the schools are looking to get more information about. Keep that in mind as you're thinking about, when you're building out that timeline or as you're building out the timeline to do this outreach. Specifically, as far as time goes, again, it's probably different for everyone. Right now, it's already mid-August, or mid-July. And like you mentioned, Matt, some of those school deadlines are coming up in early September. So I would say, now, maybe yesterday, no, now is a good time. Like if you haven't really thought about who to approach your recommendations, definitely now is a time, especially for round one. For those who have already started having, kind of doing the thinking, the thought process and thinking about who to best approach, perfect. You want to give them, I would say, at least 4 to 6 weeks out, maybe to at least have the conversation, put it on their radar. Because again, like time just goes really fast, especially, everyone's really busy. If you're asking for recommendations from multiple schools, although it's for the most part, they follow a common format and it's easy to kind of copy and paste or repurpose a lot of the content, it still takes time to get all of those written up and submitted, creating accounts, all those other like kind of, administrative logistical things. So make sure you give them enough time 4 to 6 weeks is a good starting point. Earlier is okay too. It gives them plenty of time to, it gives you plenty of time to work with them. And Rachel's going to touch upon this in more depth, but there is, you want to give them a little bit of coaching as you're building out their recommendations, or as they're, when you give them the time frame to submit the recommendations. Also to be able to have multiple communication touch points to send reminders. And again, you're not just dumping something, on someone who could be probably very busy. And it gives them just more time to put thought into writing a really strong, compelling recommendation.
So building on Jessica's comments, and Stanish and other viewers are going to be very interested in what you now have to share, Rachel, working with recommenders, because if you're also confident that they will be addressing certain areas of your professional performance, perhaps, then you don't need to, maybe in the essays. So how all of this dovetails together, what is your advice and guidance, sort of sitting down, touch points, and just this whole process to work with the recommenders that you've selected?
Sure. So the first thing we suggest is that we often recommend that you write a brief for your recommender that really gives them all the information that they are going to need to know during the process. So this can be what we discussed earlier about the qualities that business schools are looking for, specifics about questions, deadlines, word counts by school. Very important that they know exactly what you're asking of them and what is going to be asked for every school. A little bit about why you want an MBA, if that's relevant and that's not something that you've already discussed with them, so that they have a little bit of that context. And then finally, and most important, is specific examples that are going to help remind them of all the great work that you have done. That's really, really, really key, and an incredibly important way to get one of those strong recommendations out of your recommenders. There is a fine line between giving too little information and too much information. You do not want to give them so much detail that they're just going to copy and paste, or they're just going to follow what you've written. You don't want to spoon feed them. You want the recommendation to be authentic. So you want them to write how they see about you, but at the same time, you don't want them to be missing key gaps in the information and not remember the projects that you slaved over and where you did all of this work. So a couple of things here is it can be helpful to attach old evaluations, especially if they're great evaluations, then that can help jog their memory. It is also much more effective for your recommender to write about examples of what they have actually seen you do. Once again, to the writing the recommendation for them, this follows in the category of other things we really, really, really try to urge our clients not to do, which is don't try to brief your recommender to write about a project that they are not familiar with. It's not going to sound authentic. There are, this is what you were talking about, Matt, earlier, there are other places on your application where you can put some of these things. If it's something that you know is important to your candidacy, but your recommender isn't familiar with it, then that's something that goes somewhere else, either on your resume, in the application, in your essay. Find a different way to work it in. Don't try to shove it in with somebody who can't actually speak about it. And then also just make sure your recommender knows that if they want to write about something else than what you've suggested, they should feel free to do so, because often people will come back with something different and it's way, way, way better than your suggestions. It's something you didn't even realize you had done or thought of that is actually very impressive. And then my final tip on the brief is that it can be effective to frame your examples using how and why to guide your recommender on what they should be saying without giving them the specifics. So for example, saying, can you explain how I was able to get support for the stalled project and what the challenges were I faced in executing it? Or can you explain why this was a particularly difficult client situation and why you think I was so effective at managing it? Or can you explain what qualities and skills I possess that you think made me able to succeed? Those are questions that still tell the recommender what they should be talking about, but they leave room for the recommender to do their own thinking about it. And then once you've written this brief, we recommend that you schedule time to discuss it with your recommender. The written brief is important, but it is very, very helpful to go over it with them when you give it to them. You can explain in more detail what the business schools are looking for. You can go over your examples with your recommender. You can see, are these things that they will actually want to write about, or do they have different ideas and suggestions? And then you can also answer questions they have. You can remind them about things, go into some of the specifics about a project that they may have forgotten, or just answer questions about the recommendation themselves. And between the written recommendation and the verbal briefing, if you do those two things, you're really going to help put your recommender in a position where they're going to be able to write you that strong recommendation. As long as, and now Jessica's going to talk about the things that you don't want to do during the process.
But perhaps just to wrap up on that sort of time frame, preparing that brief, then once you've shared it, having a discussion with them, perhaps also, Rachel, then setting a time, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever seems appropriate, to then reconnect with them and see how they're getting on, sort of next step.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, as you said, that they might have had further reflection and said, I'd like to introduce this. So it just gives both of you, I guess, the opportunity to touch base and make sure that things are heading in the right direction.
Yes, every recommendation and recommender is a different situation, but if you have a relationship where you can have that informal conversation about what they're going to write about, what they're going to highlight, it can be really helpful for you then when you're working on the rest of the application to know what they're communicating, what they're going to cover, and having that informal conversation and touching base absolutely is a huge help if your recommender is able to do that.
Great. Well, perhaps that's then a good segue, Jessica, for some of the pitfalls to avoid it in sharing some of those, and I'm sure almost comical things you might have sometimes seen in the admissions office during your career. One question that's come up in a couple of different ways is, what's enough time with a recommender? If I've only been with a company for a month, will that just look too lightweight, too short, versus does it have to be at least 2 years? So perhaps that, and then some of the other pitfalls that you think it's important candidates avoid.
Yeah. I mean, it's really case by case, for everybody, depending on how closely you worked with, this supervisor or this potential recommender. But in general, I guess rule of thumb from what I've seen pattern wise is it's really difficult for someone who's only known you for a very brief amount of time, maybe for a month, to really get to know in depth all of those qualities about you, your work, your potential, because you just haven't had enough time to really cultivate that relationship. So it's something that you can always address in the optional essay, why you did not, if you just started a job, right before applying to business school, let's say, or you haven't worked with your current supervisor for a long time because it's, a brand new person, you can explain the context, the reason behind why you chose maybe alternate individuals to submit those recommendations on your behalf. And the adcoms will understand. It'll give, if there's a reason behind it and they're just not going to write something that's going to give a lot of information, then it makes sense. It doesn't have to be so long, like they've known you for the entire duration of your career, where they've seen your entire history of your career progress, everything. But if there is someone who can speak to genuinely about all these elements, and someone who has seen your growth and can speak to that in a very compelling way with examples, shedding insight, in that area, that would, I think, be really helpful to have that information. But ultimately, think back to that question of who's going to write the strongest recommendation, with who's going to be supportive, be my advocate, and also provide, the meaty insight and the color that's going to really grab the attention of the reader. So I guess that would be what to consider as you're thinking about that timeline of how long you've been in this relationship with your recommender. Okay. Okay, so as far as pitfalls go, everything that we mentioned, the opposite of that would be a pitfall, basically. No, but again, I guess going back to how oftentimes, it's not uncommon for applicants to kind of put a recommendation on the back burner to a certain degree and maybe focus really more on the essays or more on the test scores, and think that this is just more of a supplement. It's really not. It's really an important piece of the entire holistic application review. So make sure that you take it very seriously. Make sure that you have the conversations and really think about, in depth about who's going to be the best person for you. To piggyback on what Rachel was mentioning as she was giving guidance on how to work with your recommender, there really is a balance between over briefing your recommender and under briefing them. So if you're failing to give any information or to give very, very like, high level and, kind of the information on why you're going to business school and kind of what you want them to write, it's going to be reflected, especially if they're not comfortable or familiar with business school recommendations, it's going to be reflected in the content, unfortunately. And definitely have seen, folks who thought they were submitting an amazing letter of recommendation, so supportive, but it just lacked substance. It was just very fluffy, and we just kind of left feeling disappointed that we wanted more, from the recommendation itself, and we just weren't getting it. And it just leaves you feeling like, oh, I just wish they could have given more, just more concrete examples or more specifics. And so just make sure that you communicate that. But on the flip side is when you over prep them so much where you're basically writing the recommendation for them, and you're effectively losing their voice at the end of the day in the rec itself. And that's going to also lose that connection with the adcoms and the person who's evaluating your application. So if you're over prepping and almost like, and sometimes if you're providing too much information on projects that, like Rachel mentioned, they weren't even really involved in, and if they're inundated with too much, it's just too much detail to sift through, then that's also going to be reflected. There might be a lack of clarity or focus in the recommendation itself. So just, use your best judgment when you're briefing them. Like, give them enough so they understand why you're applying to school, the business schools. Give them, the specifics about deadlines and, just the logistical information to make sure they get everything in on time and they have enough of the, enough time to write something that's meaningful, and then that balance of the detail that you want to provide. Something that I found also was kind of disappointing in recommendation is when you can tell, like, the recommenders were they were prepped, right? They were given some information and like given a context to work with, but they're giving the same examples to both recommenders. Especially this is coming from someone who's working with individuals from the same company in the workplace, and they kind of draw on the same examples for both recommenders to discuss. And that's also disappointing because you want to be able to strategically use the recommendations to talk about different elements of your candidacy, whether it's analytical skills, interpersonal, resilience, all those qualities, leadership. But if you're using the same kind of specifics to outline and to provide those examples, and it's not, again, going to give as much dimension as what we'd like. So think about ways like your recommenders can highlight different elements of who you are and your accomplishments and what you can bring, to the MBA classroom, to the culture, as well as like as a future business leader. And then of course, writing the letter for your recommenders is definitely something, again, we highly discourage, because more often than not, adcoms will be able to feel and see or get a sense that there's something that seems very similar with these recommendations. And just know that when you're working on your applications, you're getting deeply immersed. You're like in the weeds. So it's sometimes hard to get that, higher level perspective and know like something it seems like there's, like I'm drawing on the same elements, or there's too much similarities in tone. You're not going to be able to really grasp that because you're going to be so immersed in the whole process itself. So keep that in mind, really the bulleting out and having enough content for the recommenders to write out their responses in their own words. Doesn't matter if they're not, familiar with English, or if they're not the best writers, they're not the best storytellers. It's really about them providing that story in their own authentic voice. Getting hung up on the titles and seniority, you'd be surprised at how many people do this. And I've gotten it's actually been really cool to read recommendations, or I should just say a very brief letter from some really, celebrities, from heads of state, presidents, senators, whatever, right? CEOs. And yet it's very obvious that they don't know who this person is. So again, disappointing. It's a cool story to share in an AdCom meeting to say, ooh, I got a letter from Elon Musk, but then there's nothing substantive about it. So it's not really going to help bolster that candidacy. And I think overall, really, again, the communication is going to be important. You'll be really surprised at how much your recommenders want to work with you. They might ask like, I just want to make sure, like, I was going to write about, this one particular project. They're going to be, oftentimes they might want to touch base, and you want to give them enough of that lead time to be able to do so, where they're not crunched like 24 hours before, right? And they just have to kind of get something out before the deadline. And schools, you don't want to try to push the boundaries and think that, oh, it's okay if I submit this late. It's not going to hinder my application. Schools can be very strict about deadlines. So just make sure that you give enough of the lead time to be able to, just let life happen. And if something does come up, they still have enough bandwidth to be able to submit on time. So those are some of my advice.
If Elon Musk offers to tweet a recommendation, well, I don't think he's going to be using Twitter for very much longer. But I take that as a no. I think both of you in the last hour have really been able to emphasize and demonstrate the importance of letters of recommendation, which I think was fundamental to what we hope to achieve with today's masterclass. So perhaps then with all of that guidance, things to avoid, Rachel, just one final thought from you, advice for any candidates as they're about to take this next step with recommenders?
Sure. So when you are talking to recommenders, remember that their job and what it's about is about the impact that you had on your organization and how you have changed it for the better. So there's a quote from an admissions director who said, "What we want to know is how your footsteps through an organization have made a difference." And that's a great quote. I think it really captures it. And that is what your recommendations should do, is show how you have made a difference in your organization.
Footsteps. I think I know who you're describing. One final word from another school on the East Coast for all of our viewers is that the number 2 in admissions at Harvard Business School just a year or two ago reached out to a lot of the traditional feeders, the McKinseys, Bains, BCGs, the Carlyles, the BlackRocks, the big banks, the big tech firms, and said, we really need your recommenders to step up. We have so many applications. We're looking for your superstars. And I think that just reinforces everything that Jessica and Rachel have shared in the last 60 minutes of how you can then very effectively and very powerfully work with your recommendations. They have very kindly also answered so many of the great questions that you throw in. So I don't have any more. I feel that you've covered so much ground, but it might then be that the next step is talking through your options, some of those choices. Is there a head of state, that CEO, but you're worried that it might just be a paragraph and that's not going to cut it? So do reach out to Fortuna to share your background. As I said, we take these calls very, very seriously, prepare them, and recommenders, of course, is a key part of that discussion so that you come away, we hope, with great, insightful advice. I mentioned that this, of course, was one in a number of masterclasses that we're running through this month. We're now about, 7 weeks from the first round 1 deadlines. You can capture the previous sessions on our YouTube channel, looking at the essays, and then next Wednesday, we'll be taking a dive into the resume and those all important application forms and everything else. But I think it leaves me to thank both Rachel and for Jessica, not just for your time always. It's a joy to share these webinars with you, but for bringing so much insight. Lots and lots of the readers, as they asked their questions, they said, this was great. This has been incredibly helpful. So thank you to both of you for everything that you've shared in the last hour with us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.